Can the United States reshore manufacturing in a way that's going to help us meet our goals with respect to security, economic development, jobs, climate change? This has been a major theme for US policymakers over the last few years. How do we restore a sense of dynamism to the US economy? And how do we bring back the industries that we've lost or build the industries of the future? Today on New Shores Live, we're talking to Jonathan Tan, CEO and co-founder of CoreShell Technologies, a company at the heart of innovation in battery technologies and domestic manufacturing. Jonathan, welcome to New Shores Live. It's good to have you here at CSIS.
Thanks, Joseph. Really appreciate you having me on the podcast. I think it's a really important time to be talking about these topics. One thing that I will say is that so much has happened to highlight the need for this level of conversation. And to me, it's been just a building momentum towards this moment. And I think it's a kind of that critical, I don't want to say make or break moment, but it does feel like we're at a sort of critical juncture in the journey for US and its manufacturing and resilience.
I absolutely agree. And there's been so many headlines, even over the last couple of weeks, about changing policy with respect to tariffs, with respect to foreign entity of concern rules. We're going to get into all of that with you today. And I'm really glad actually we're able to do this live because the people want to hear from you, a man in the arena, so to say, of what this actually looks like from people trying to build industry here again in the United States. But Jonathan, before we do that, just give us a very brief picture. Who are you? What is CoreShell, and what do you guys do?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I'm Jonathan Tan. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at CoreShell. We started the company back in 2017, and the mission for us was how do we make the most affordable and abundantly produced battery materials, and how do we get them at scale? So we've always thought about how our innovation can really translate into large-scale manufacturing. And now what we've done is that we've converted that technical know-how to convert what is the largest critical mineral that we produce in the United States, silicon. It's the only critical mineral that has the domestic production to replace a lot of our needs in the battery arena that relies heavily on Chinese materials, specifically Chinese graphite. So there's no other resource here in the US that we produce domestically today that has a chance of replacing Chinese graphite and our reliance on Chinese materials. So silicon is the only choice, and we are the only company that has been able to take commodity grade silicon called metallurgical silicon, lightly process it and convert it into an actual functional commercial battery material. And that's what we're deploying now at small commercial scale, and we're growing. We've got automotive customers and partners. We're supplying this to defense. And we would love to make this the default material for the US to be able to build up the supply chain resilience that it's been talking about, it's been clamoring for. But as we'll talk about today, there's been, both tailwinds and headwinds to make that possible. And we'd love to, give our input on, like you mentioned, what it feels like as a company trying to build in this environment and what are both, I'd say both the pros and the cons of what's going on in today's environment.
Give us a sense of scale, right? So over the last few years, post the Inflation Reduction Act, there was an incredible degree of investment in the United States, sector-wide in battery manufacturing, right? But can you give us kind of some sectoral numbers? What are the most important trends in the industry that you think viewers should know and understand as a basis for our conversation?
It's a great question, and if you allow me, I think it's a bit of a nuanced one. I think I was just actually at a conference recently in the Bay Area where we convened stakeholders. We had executives from automotive companies. We had innovators like myself. We had folks from defense. We had folks from energy storage and data centers, and people who had been in battery manufacturing and the battery industry for decades. And honestly, I think it was the most frank conversation that I felt like as an industry we've had since I've been around since 2017. And so in a way,
tell me more about that. So it got frank. What's the core question here?
the core question is, why is the US getting beat handedly by China? That is the
Yeah,
question. Right? Like
and that's
that
exactly
is the
what I
core.
that's exactly
Yeah,
what I want to get into, because like the macro picture on battery technology specifically seems quite positive, right? You've
absolutely,
got
absolutely.
you've got a lot of investment over the past few years in the US. Now, some of that is being dialed back as market expectations for EVs are changing, and a variety of other policies that we're going to talk about. But I have to say that one should have the intuition. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like one should have the intuition that this is a growing sector, in like power. It's a growing field in automotive. Like batteries are an interesting generalized technology for the US to try to get a foothold in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you take a look at the future of what US needs, regardless of the industry and regardless of politics, let's leave politics out of it, right? Transportation, obviously, in electrification of vehicles, that's become politicized, even though I shouldn't, and I'll have some numbers there, but even if you take that out of there, batteries for defense, batteries for energy storage so that we can meet our AI demands, right? The power hungry AI demand that's coming online, batteries to make our grid more resilient. There's really nothing that's not going to use batteries in this upcoming domain. So I totally agree with you.
Batteries to make our laptops work longer.
Batteries to make your laptop work so you shouldn't have to be on your iPhone. All these things need batteries. And so I do agree that if you take a look at the macro trends, batteries are critical. And the question I think I'll bring it back to what you were saying is, how do we make it so that we have a resilient battery
Right.
production? And I think this is something that is not, it shouldn't be political, right? Like we
Yeah.
need to have resilience. And I'll give this as a pro to what this administration has done. If nothing else, I think it's really highlighted this key need. And we can debate about the tariffs and that whatsoever, but it's really highlighted, okay, we're completely reliant on a foreign source. We're
Yeah.
completely reliant on China. Let's be specific. We're completely reliant on China right now. They're beating the pants off of us, despite the fact that we have made a bunch of investments. And, long story short, as a preview, I think there's now a come to Jesus type of moment of have we made the right investments in battery technology? Have we
Right.
invested in the right ways in battery technology? And this is one thing that I'll say that I was really happy hearing from the conference that I was just at was I think America for the past decade or so, or just in its history, has relied on the fact that it can out innovate folks, right? It has the ability to out, and it's done this in arenas like AI. It was the first to create a lot of the chemistries that became the mainstream battery chemistries. For example, America created LFP, which is now lithium iron phosphate, which is now seen as the quote unquote Chinese battery, right? We created that.
Right.
We innovated that here. They, took that and scaled it. And so the thought process now is like, okay, well, we're just going to do that again. We're going to out innovate China. And that's going to, there's been talk of like, quote unquote, maybe a leapfrog type of technology, or solid state, right? Things that
Right.
can really be a leapfrog. But really, I think what what was missing was the fact that because of the current, global position, China is spending billions of dollars on innovation. They're not standing still. They're
Right.
innovating as much or more so than we are. You can take a look at the numbers, right? Nature published their numbers on the most
Mm-hmm.
publicized and stated
You're talking about
research
like
papers,
publications,
scientific
in top
publications.
scientific journals. Yes.
China's beating the pants out of the US now on that sort of
Right.
stuff. And so we can no longer really rely on this false sense that we're just gonna
Yeah.
out innovate China and that's how we're gonna compete. We need to really, if we're gonna be serious about having, again, this resilience for batteries that we critically need for almost all the major industries that we have, we need to invest in basic things like manufacturing, scale up, production, workforce development,
Right.
energy and grid, and really like
So
fundamental things that the US has not done for decades.
well, let me ask you for some texture there, right? So you're at a meeting with your peers, right? And investors and other companies. The problem is easy to identify. The US is not competitive with China. And for a variety of security and economic security reasons, that's seen as a problem. So there's like two ways to get around that, in my view. One, we could just choose to pay more. We're going to stand up protections, tariffs, other trade barriers. We're going to subsidize production here in the United States. And we just sort of force our way through the issue. The other is we look for alternatives that are going to have better qualities or like something we can produce in the United States, like what your company is doing. Are those the two pathways that we have?
I mean, I think that in some sense you're correct. We can either choose to pay more for certain things. I would say that it's honestly like we need to do all the above, to be
Right.
honest.
Okay.
Like it's not an either or to me. Like we will need to at times invest. I wouldn't say pay more, but invest early on into things and spend money, allocate federal funding, allocate funding towards the things that we think are critically important. And we do need to innovate. I don't want to say that we're not trying to innovate. Obviously, CoreShell is trying to innovate, but we need to innovate in ways that are scalable and really utilize the things that US already has some sort of sense of being able to produce at scale, right? Let's not try to reinvent the wheel with something that is just wholly going to be impossible to scale for the next 10 years. And then, we need to invest in and we need to be smart about investing in the types of infrastructure and projects that we can produce here in the United States. We can, get off the ground, and be realistic about some of these things, right? Like we're not going to go out necessarily and build a new mine for materials anytime in the next 10 years.
We're going to try, but let's talk about how this is going, right? So the United States has brought policy to this challenge. There are tariffs on battery goods coming from China that are both general, meaning the 15% tariffs under Section 122, or there are sector-specific tariffs that are applied to battery technologies. And there's been a lot of churn in that with the recent Supreme Court finding. What's the read in the industry of where the tariff policies are at? And then we're going to talk a minute about the sort of the pull side and the subsidy rules.
Sure. I think the broad reaction here is that within the U.S. industry, the tariffs are a good forcing function to kind of reevaluate, what it's needed to give U.S. manufacturers and companies a chance to compete. So in that sense, I would say that there has been some positive coming from just having that and that forcing function of, okay, let's really evaluate what it means to buy American goods versus goods from overseas. And I think there's a good thought process behind that. And what I'll say is that if you kind of zoom out a little bit further, it's interesting because tariffs have become also a political hot topic of debate. To me, it's actually just a different flavor from the previous administration. Whereas, and both sides have become politicized, right? IRA was politicized, tariffs are now politicized. They're actually both trying to accomplish the same thing. They're just using the carrot or the stick approach, right? One is doing one thing, one is doing the other.
I mean, they're really at the heart, they're trying to get over like a pretty big cost differential, right?
Yeah, that's right. They're trying and like an inertia differential, right? Like we need some inertia to go force companies to have something to build. The problem really is this kind of frenetic every single week change in the actual numbers, right? Like if you go into the actual numbers. And the reason why I'm saying that is that, again, I was at this conference and I was talking to folks, people need to make multi-billion-dollar decisions on implementations of plants and facilities and manufacturing. Let's tie back again. What does America need? America needs manufacturing. It needs both the raw materials production, the midstream, and the finished goods. It needs all three of those to be able to compete. And we're behind on all three of those. Let's just be frank. And we need new innovation, and we need new technologies. And so, if you think about those things, though, the major manufacturing and the buildup of a whole complete supply chain, those are not 1 or 2 year decisions, right? Those are not like, okay, we're going to decide to do this within this administration. Those are going to be lasting past and beyond this current administration. They're far beyond the previous one. And so to have this just frenetic change of like one day it's IRA, the next day it's tariffs. Who knows if the tariffs are going to be gone? The Supreme Court ruling, outlaw
Mhm.
tariffs, Trump brings them back in full force. That's hard enough on like a monthly planning basis for purchasing departments. Think about how hard that is when you're talking about major capital investments, right?
Right.
From the US companies, even from foreign companies that we want to invest. Let's talk about some of our Korean partners who are investing billions of dollars to help build, battery facilities here, or our Japanese partners. Those types of investments, if we're going to try to attract people to make major investments to go build up those facilities, we can't have this sort of frenetic,
Right.
uh, you know, every single week change in what the numbers and
So
economics really look like.
so for you and your peers, the uncertainty projects, I would assume, into two places. On the one hand, you've got sort of what is our market competitiveness compared to imported batteries or batteries that rely heavily on the Chinese supply chain, because those are still legal to use just under tariffs. Or you've got your own complicated value chains and supply chains. You're making the metallurgical silicon in the United States, but you need a lot of other things as well. Is one of those more important than the other when you're talking about weighing uncertainty and these multi-billion-dollar investments?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that both are important. I'll kind of add in onto the first one, right? Or what is our market potential for
Yeah.
making this a viable, commercial thing? By the way, CoreShell started this long before tariffs or incentives, right? And we
Mhm.
have a real foundational unit economic. Our stuff is cheaper than graphite. It's the only thing that you can produce in the United States that's cheaper than graphite. So there is a real fundamental, economic basis. And I think more technologies like that need to have that foundational unit economics to survive this current, administration policy change on a daily basis. And that's how I think we have the largest value proposition, is that we are tariff proof. Like, we don't care whether the tariffs are here. They help us in some cases because it gives people even more of an incentive to look at a new technology like core shells, but we don't need it for the business case or the survival. Where I will say that it really makes a difference, though, is I think the amount of public investments and market interests in some of these things can be very dependent on the perception of its economic value, right? For CoreShell,
Right.
for others, right? And that also makes a big difference when startups like ourselves or even larger companies go out and try to get market interest, public or private, to go capitalize these major innovative changes, or build up plants and facilities. We have to make a justification, and it can't just be a monthly one. It has to be a long-term one that we have to be able to predict and show real economic numbers around. And thankfully, we can do that without the tariffs. But it still plays a part in having to justify, okay, what is our real value proposition for
Yeah.
these things? And it kind of goes back to, what we were talking about at the very beginning. I think that's really one of the things that China has just done so much better than the US, whether that's the nature of their political system or whether that's, yeah, and again, I can't necessarily fix all those things.
Right.
But I can just advocate for the fact that, when China has a strategy, it's a national cohesive strategy, right? And one of the things that this is before the conference that I talked to, the thing that, companies here in the United States, and I felt like this for a while, struggle with is that, in actuality, CoreShell is not actually competing against Chinese companies. We're competing against China as a country. We're competing against a whole country. No, it sounds funny, but it's true, right? Like,
Mm.
we are effectively, all these private companies, small or large, in the United States are competing with a whole national ecosystem that has trillions of dollars to spend, right? That
Right.
dwarfs any single even large corporation here dwarfs any single like individual
I'm
corporation.
I'm so
And
glad you
that
brought
is
that up.
really, really hard, right? That's just really hard.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. We recently at CSIS in our Economic Security and Technology Department, which our energy program is a part of, we published a fairly large and substantial report called the Tech Edge Project, which looked exactly at the question that you just implicated, John. Sort of how do the ecosystems in China and the U.S. kind of differ when it comes to innovation, technology, and your ability to capitalize on the United States' historical strength in sort of like bench innovation and high-end science where you come from, and make sure that you're able to reap the benefits of that kind of innovation for security and economic strategy where China has been historically quite strong. I do recommend people check that out. Jonathan, we'll send you a copy as well. Um, let's talk a little bit about the pull side though, because one of the ways China did this, achieve this sort of dominating position in battery technology, was subsidizing production and demand.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've been sort of like talking myself blue in the face about is, despite the fact that O3B, or the One Big Beautiful Bill, did take pretty big chunks out of the US's subsidies for clean energy. Actually, on the manufacturing side, in particular with batteries, there's still a lot of support there, but it's coming with new rules. And in
Mhm.
particular, these foreign entity of concern rules, which are meant to say if you want subsidy from the United States for making or deploying battery technologies, you need to have an endogenous supply chain to a certain percentage. I believe the rules now say that 60% of battery components have to be non-Chinese this year. What is
Mhm.
your read on that? Is anybody ready to meet this standard? And if it's going to rise to 85 or 90% by the end of the decade, are U.S. manufacturers and technology value chains ready to step in?
It's a great question. I think that the FEOC issues, to be honest, actually started in the Biden administration, right? So
Yeah,
this is not actually anything new. It's something that the U.S. has been trying to implement for a while, and frankly, I think that there's a lot of value in really what it's hoping to accomplish, right?
yeah.
Like I mentioned, we rely entirely on a foreign nation for not just the finished goods, but all the raw materials that get out there, right? And we're at risk, not just, I think that tariffs, what it's done is that it's created a economic risk profile now, but there's other geopolitical risks that are outside of our control. I'll just name one. What if a war breaks out, right?
Right.
Which is
Yeah, of
not,
course.
out of reason right now, based on the new news, right? So those sorts of things, I think, forcing us to be uncomfortable and try to meet some pretty hefty standards to go build up a resilient supply chain, I support. Are people ready for it? Generally, probably no. And that's one thing that I think CoreShell has been pushing for a while. So you're kind of allowing me to make my company pitch here is, hey, we're bringing something, and the numbers don't lie. You can go look at the U.S. Geological Survey report. What does America make a lot of? It makes a lot of silicon. If you take a look at the
Yeah.
critical minerals list, it makes almost none of all the other materials. It makes a lot of silicon right now. So why not utilize that to go bolster our needs here at this critical juncture? So that is
Are
the
are
pitch that we're doing.
are there particular sectors or deployment cases where you think we can kind of find a lot of harmony or like build into scale quickly? And I realize that's a fine question, but let me expand a bit. So during the Biden administration, the EVs were the driver, right?
Mhm.
Just
Yeah.
incredible volume of batteries necessary for the American vehicle fleet. It's an enormous part of the economy. So you had this enormous pull signal driven by a $7,500 tax credit for EVs, which had the FIAC rules. So we were trying to endogenize the supply chain
Yep.
with
Yep.
that policy. Um, that is now gone, but we're still seeing grid deployment in or of batteries for electricity service. We've got batteries in the defense context, and we still have the manufacturing tax credits. But when you're looking at the market, are there places, whether it's in drone technology or defense or personal computers, or are EVs still the driver here? Where should people be thinking about finding a lot of synchronicity and opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this kind of goes. I'll mention this. it's funny how market perception and sort of like the, headline news really influences this and can have a real cognitive dissonance about what's like reality of the numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was just at the battery conference, and one of the things I was talking about is people are really looking at this as a quote unquote, people have termed this EV winter, like you couldn't, open a headline and see probably worse news about the U.S. EV production and the demand and all those sorts of things. But in
Yeah.
reality, honestly, EVs are still selling. They're about 8% of the market. They will continue to rise. And globally, the story has long shifted, right? Over half of China's new car sales are EVs. And so if you take a look at that, and also if you just make projections, right? So people are saying, okay, well, EVs still take up a majority of the battery demand right now. I think it's, last time I checked,
Hmm.
over 90% of batteries go to EVs.
Oh,
But the
wow.
question is, okay, wow, what happens when the AI boom comes out? And, we need all these data centers, we need energy storage. If you look at the most aggressive projections for EV or for ESS and data centers, and you look at the most negative projections for EVs, in 2030, EVs will still be 75% of the demand for batteries. And so it's funny that like but as a battery innovation company, I can tell you this, the perception for public and private investors in automotive and EV space is that it's almost like a taboo. We were not going to invest in that whatsoever,
Right.
because of this market perception of okay, EVs are tailing off. And so there's a bit of this cognitive dissonance of what's really pulling the market and what's driving it. And I think I'll tie it back to policy. I think the thing that really is concerning to me is the politicization of these things, right? Like EVs versus ICE vehicles.
Right.
And maybe that was a fault of people in the EV making it so much about, climate change and sustainability. I drive some EVs. Honestly, it's just a better product. At the end of the day,
Right.
once people get in these things and you drive around, it'll be a better product. And we just need to ensure that we don't fall behind. And all of a sudden, once there is more pull for and demand for electric vehicles,
Mm.
all of a sudden the only choices that we have for a moderately priced, reasonably good electric vehicle, they have to come from China, right? Because the US
Well,
has fallen so far behind that they can't even make these things.
I have to say that it raises an interesting question about how we think about energy security or economic security. The two are so tied at this moment, it's hard for me to even distinguish them particularly well. Because when you have an ICE vehicle fleet, right, you have a rough intuition of a barrel of oil, right? Like you can imagine one. People might have seen a 55-gallon drum at some point. Um, and so you're able to, if you're thinking about security, you're thinking about national strategy, you sort of have a set of tools and intuitions that are applicable to that system. And I think you're right. I immediately agree with you that the market is telling us that we're going to be making maybe not a shift to 100% EVs by 2035 or what have you, but like people are choosing these cars for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
And then the technology is 30% of the rest of that technology or battery is going to go into other parts of the economy. So you do sort of like you don't want to walk into this economic security problem where suddenly you're highly dependent on a single source, one that
Mhm.
is kind of adversarial, practices unfair trade rules, all sorts of other things. Um, and so you like arrive at this place where we need like intuitions about the economic security challenge of suddenly having a lot of batteries being important for the economy. So can you help us? Sorry for the preamble, but can you help us understand how to think about a megawatt hour of battery storage? Is that the right unit? And is that the right way to, sort of think about our capacity to produce that and deploy that into the economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond. Well, when you look at it, it's not megawatts, it's gigawatts, right? That we
Right.
need in the United States, and it's really measured by the number of gigafactories that we're producing here in the United States. I think when I was there, people were talking about China and CATL, and they're producing now gigawatt battery facilities within 12 months, which is incredible. Like 12 months, a new gigafactory is brought up, and I heard from somebody who used to work in China. He said from his office he could see 14 gigafactories in China. 14 gigafactories just sitting from his office viewpoint, just looking out on the facility. And in the US, like we have less than half of what he could see out his front window, right? Just
Nationally.
in total,
Yeah.
nationally. So I think that just kind of goes to speak to, again, the sort of planning and long-term strategy and really influence of saying, okay, we know that 10 years from now, and again, let's take the political out of it. I kind of went on a soapbox talking about EVs. It doesn't matter, right? To me, and I have no vested interest in this game. Like we'll sell batteries for EVs, we'll sell batteries to grid storage, we'll sell batteries to defense. We'll sell battery materials to all those industries. We're not really trying to promote one over the other. Really, what we're trying to promote is let's invest US dollars in the right places that get us to where we need to be. And let's just think a little bit more long term of, okay, what are the things that we need to be a resilient country 10 years from now? And by all accounts, in my opinion, I don't think anyone has a debate, is batteries they're going to have to be one of those big things, right? We kind of just talked about this. And so let's not ride this kind of like wave of like, let's not ride the wave of sentiment of like, what's hot now, what's not hot now. Let's invest in kind of like the critical pieces that we're going to need and make sure that we're able to produce those things in volume here in the US. That's kind of my.
So is it fair to say, just like as a matter of developing an intuition, the US wants dozens of gigawatts of battery capacity a decade hence?
Dozens of gigafactories, right? Dozens of
gigafactories, right?
Each of those gigafactories, by the way, when we're talking about gigafactories, they're about 40 to 60 gigawatt hours of battery production. I think somebody mentioned this that I thought was really applicable. I think if you take a look at if you're going to, move to, batteries and energy storage as our main source for energy and power. I think people have done this calculation that we would need somewhere around like 2,000 gigafactories across the planet, like 2,000, right? That's not immediate, right? Like that's switching over from, our petrochemical based dependency to more of a battery based dependency. And we can debate on what that is. But and the funny thing is, if you also then take a look at how many refineries do we have across the world, it's also about 2,000, right? So it's about, I think that's a good way. You mentioned, barrel of oil, kilowatt of batteries or a megawatt of batteries. I think you can kind of think about those things. If you think about it from a factory perspective, like I mentioned, it's like we need to have as many battery producing facilities as we have refineries. And I can tell you, I used to work in oil and gas, right? You can drive in every state. You'll find an oil refinery somewhere and multiple in most locations, right? We just need more of that infrastructure if we're really going to invest in batteries. Hopefully I made the case like this is going to be the future. It doesn't matter which industry it goes to. This is going to be what we need to invest in.
This is why we do the New Shores Live podcast, because that is suddenly like such an excellent analogy to think about for intuition, right? How do you, like, a gigafactory is like akin to a refinery, right? Thank you, Jonathan. That's incredible. Okay, now gigafactories, gigawatt hours are built from megawatt hours. You're in the game. You're trying to expand production for your technologies still at this sort of 100 megawatt scale, if I'm not mistaken. Like, if you could have one policy change, cognizant of all of the uncertainty and the challenges that we've already discussed, that would make it easier for you to do that, not just once, but 10 times, what would it be?
It's a great question. This is going to be honestly probably unsatisfactory, but if I were to have one policy change, um, and again, okay, let's think big picture, right?
Hmm.
One thing that I would advocate for is for the US to consider in these major industries, and battery being one of them, but not necessarily all of them, to have somebody that exists beyond this kind of 2-year cycle of political
Hmm.
appointees, someone that has a little bit more of a long-term capacity to really influence policy, right? And the reason why I'm saying this is that I don't think that necessarily, in some ways, that tariffs or incentives or all these things, if they're done effectively, each side of things could work, right?
Right.
And we can debate on the effectiveness of how they've implemented those, but in theory, in kind of like the philosophical sense, they could have effectiveness and both have pros and cons.
So what I'm
But we
hearing
need
is
something more consistency. We just need a
right,
consistent policy that is more tenure. And so can we have, I think this was promoted during the conference I was at, can we have a battery czar, right? Can we have
right,
a critical minerals czar? Can we have somebody that really oversees the strategy from a longer term perspective and is not beholden to sort of the whims of, okay, having to get reelected or having to kowtow to a current administration? That would be my wish, right? Like that would make it
right.
way more reasonable, and that would actually drive a lot more reasonable action in the market, in my opinion, because then people would actually take a look at what is good for us, not what is going to kind of meet the flavor of the month, so to
So
speak.
so I hear from you, it's not one particular regulatory change or one particular change to this or that policy, but the United States needs a strategic view on sort
Yeah.
of what are the benchmarks we want to hit, and then we can make modifications and we can make changes along the way to help better realize that long-term vision. Is that a national ethos or is it an individual?
I mean, I think it's got to be a national ethos, right?
Yeah.
And but I'll say this, which is again, I've been trying to be, even-handed and fair on some of these things. That I will say, like one of the things that I think does a lot of damage is really over politicizing some of these things
Right.
to the point where you know saying like sustainability or EVs is now becoming something that's foreboding in this
Right.
administration.
Right.
And like if you say some of those things, you're getting like funding taken away from you in certain ways,
Right.
right? Like we just can't have these whiplash type of moments and kind of the politicization of some of these things that really shouldn't be political. Again, like I'm trying to we should take some of the
Hmm.
political teeth out of some of these things that are more national interests that are longer term valuable for us as an
Right.
economy. And like I've highlighted, both administrations and both sides of the aisle have wanted this. It's been hard for companies who are on the grounds in my space or industry to have to kind of pivot all of a sudden on kind of some of our focuses just to justify the same technology. Like we haven't
Right.
changed what we've done, but there's been so much that we've had to change from like how we talk about it to, who do we talk to, which agencies are we
Yeah.
working with, and that frankly makes a big difference, right? And that causes more friction to get things done because we're expending a lot of resources on things that in an actual ideal situation, we shouldn't be having to spend so
Right.
many resources figuring out
Well,
how to like change our wording and marketing and who do we talk to,
right.
sort of.
Well, I thank you for your candor. I mean, part of what we're trying to do with this project, New Shores Live, is exactly try and figure out, how do we look at multi-objective national strategy, right?
Yeah,
And if that can't come from policymakers today, maybe it comes from groups like CSIS or for scholars to say, all right, we see all of these different drivers: EVs, sustainability, the market, security, and the defense industrial base, and sort of how do you sort of maximize your ability to like optimize across that entire objective function as opposed to just picking one because that's what's the flavor of the month. Because that does seem to be one of the places where the US stumbles, right? We have an active, vibrant democracy. It's great at a lot of things. Endogenizing the battery value chain needs a little more stability. And in the past, we've had that and we need to restore it, I think is part of what we're trying to accomplish with this project. Jonathan, you've been very generous with your time. Let me just ask you, for those who are coming to this new technology, to this new sector, who are trying to understand the issues in the way that you and I are trying to push the conversation today, what should they look for in a year's time? What is pushing us in the right direction, and what would you view as being real problems in terms of outcomes?
I would say that in terms of outcomes, what would be negative is to continue this roller coaster ride of every single month having new news come out that
and that will mean more canceled projects, more announcements that don't come to fruition.
Yeah, just actually, the things that I think that the public is not aware of, I'll say this, that is just as damaging as the public news about things getting canceled are the projects that are not being built in the first place, right? I think those are things that the public is not aware of that from my perspective, I've heard of a lot of stuff, investments not being made, things not getting broken ground, right? Things actually falling away because people can't predict where to spend their dollars.
Right.
I'll say this, and again, this is kind of outlining, and then I'll answer the first part of the question, hopefully. But the thing that I think has been important to note is that when there is stability and there's predictability, companies will drive towards producing the lowest cost of goods, the best products. They will spend their money on making what's valuable to the consumer. When there's not, they invest in flexibility, they invest in multiple things that are not optimized. And really what it comes down to, in my opinion, I'll try to make this pitch, is that it creates more expensive customer goods and less valuable, less good things for Americans to buy at a time where American buying power in the middle class, and this is a whole nother story, is at its worst that it's been in several decades, right? So this policy and this kind of frenetic behavior is really playing into that. And it's actually, in my opinion, the danger is that the more it goes on, the further behind we're going to fall in China, because we can't get over our own 2 feet while China's like full blast ahead. And so we are actively hurting ourselves by doing this. And what would be positive is to see what would be positive from the consumer side is to see none of this news, right? That would be my dream. None of this news. We have something, no one's talking about it. It's implemented. We know what it's going to happen, and no one's talking about it anymore. That would be ideal, right? Because then,
hey, I bought this great car, or my power prices have gone down, and there's a big battery field next to the substation, or whatever.
Right, yeah. I would love for none of this to get publicized, right? Or tariffs are not the headline news. Right? It's like, okay, there's tariffs. We all know what it is. Great. Let's move on. Right. Let's move forward and do what we need to do to go adjust to that policy and go build a real business. I hate hearing about this, and I hate having to justify one way or the other. I hate having to talk to our board and our investors of this new news came out. What is CoreShell going to do about it? It's like, well, I just got this last week. I don't really know. I have to go spend hours decoding what this even means for our industry and having a sense for it. Let's just have some consistency, and that would be my hope is a year from now, if we're not talking about this on podcast, we're talking about other things, that would be the ideal.
All right, excellent. Jonathan, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. Colleagues who've stuck with us, we appreciate it very much. We've talked about so much important stuff today. I do think it's, the challenge of innovation ecosystems and making sure we can yield all of the benefits, social and economic, of innovations in the United States. This is an area that CSIS is watching closely. I do think folks should check out the Tech Edge report as a part of that conversation. I think this question of depoliticization of the battery supply chain, of batteries as a technology, and what does that mean? And how do we develop a better sense of sort of security in that space? Thing I walk away with today most vividly is the Gigafactory is the refinery in this emergent part of our economy and in the new energy economy. And we should think about what we're willing to do as a matter of public policy to achieve security for the U.S. value chain in that context. Thank you for joining us today. This has been New Shores Live. This is Joseph Majkut for CSIS signing off.